back to you.
New York has a lot of projects depending on the Highway Trust Fund, and joining me now to talk more about that is the president of the Associated General Contractors of New York, Mike Elmendorf. Hello, sir. Welcome
Hello.
back.
Good to
nice
be
to see you. So, first of all, what's happening in D.C., I mean, it's a stopgap measure at this point, and it seems to me like what it's really the problem is they don't want to talk about the gas tax.
Well, I think there's a lot of problems. I mean, the fact is this is the 5th time in 7 years that you've had to have a patch for the Federal Highway Trust Fund.
This used to be like a kumbaya thing, like both parties could get together and talk about roads.
This is an embarrassment, which is probably too mild a word, but we're on television, so I need to clean it up here, right? I mean, it's really is an embarrassment. I mean, and now tomorrow was the absolute drop-dead deadline. The House acted today. We expect the Senate to act, you know, obviously before the deadline. But the fact that we are again teetering on the precipice here in terms of federal funding for infrastructure, it should embarrass every member of Congress, and there's a lot of them, by the way, that are trying to do the right thing. And it should really upset the American people, because at the end of the day, first of all, this is one of the reasons why you have government, right, to maintain and build public infrastructure.
Sure.
And it would be aggravating enough in principle if everything was chugging along just fine on the infrastructure front. But as you well know, and we've talked about this many times, it's not. We're in a real crisis with our infrastructure. And so, you know, we're dealing with shenanigans like this in Washington where they just keep kicking the can down the road.
Okay, fine. So, and all of that is definitely true, but the real problem is where are they going to get the money? I mean, you can't get the blood from the stone. You have to talk about, you have to make hard decisions that no one wants to make in an election year. Yep. How many years has it been since the gas tax was raised?
Decades, I believe.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So that's the main way this thing gets funded, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that is true. And I think part of the problem is, you're right, there's not a will to deal with the fact that one of the reasons why the trust fund keeps running dry is there's not enough revenue. And I think it's a confluence of events. The needs of our infrastructure system are greater than they've ever been, because a lot of the infrastructure in this country, and certainly New York, was built, you know, 60 or so years ago for a 50-year lifespan. So the stuff has come into end of life. It's in bad shape. The needs are higher. But the other thing is the world has changed, right? I mean, the gas tax as a model isn't what it used to be. You've got much more fuel-efficient vehicles than you used to have. You've got hybrids. You've got alternative fuel vehicles. You've got electric vehicles. So as a long-term strategy to pay for this stuff, I'm not really sure that its shelf life is that great. And so we need to really figure out what are we going to do. And this is a conversation, obviously, in Washington, but it's a conversation that's going to be happening here in New York next year, and you know, later this year, frankly, with the budget process, because New York has to come up with a new multi-year capital program, and it's sort of the same issues on the state level as well.
Okay, but before, so interesting though that you talk about shelf life. I mean, we're smarter now, right? We're building for longer periods. I mean, if we actually invested the money in our more modern technology that we have now, I'm thinking about bridges and roads and wastewater and all sorts of things that you and I talk about all the time, how long would that life be? In other words, are we still building for 60 years, or can we build for 80?
I think you can certainly build longer now. The technology is better, the design is better, there's opportunity for innovation, there's things you can do that you couldn't do, obviously, then. So, I mean, look, investing in infrastructure, no matter how long you're building it for, is a good investment. It creates jobs, it's a very well demonstrated economic stimulus, but more importantly than that, our communities and our economy rely on it. And when you're falling apart, and I travel all over the state, I was in the southern tier earlier today, I'm coming down 88, I felt like I was on a train. That road is in such bad shape. About half of our roads are in poor condition. A third of our bridges in New York are deficient. That means every day about 17 million New Yorkers drive over a bridge that's deficient. It's third world type stuff, and it's not just a New York problem, it's an American problem. And so we need Congress, and we need the governor and the legislature to all sit down and figure out, and the president, to his credit, has been out there trying to advance some ideas on this. But people need to sit down and figure out, how are we going to pay for this stuff? It's not free.
What are we looking at in New York then? I mean, this year we're going to have an Education Bond Act. It's a $2 billion bond act. We're not talking about it all that terribly much. I assume we're going to get there at some point. It is August. People aren't paying attention. I assume a Transportation Bond Act is going to be on the horizon. Now, we heard that floated. It was more environmental in nature, but there was some water treatment ideas and et cetera. And certainly people who live, especially in Syracuse, who are watching this, know about the problems with potholes and sinkholes and the water system blowing up. So is that what we're looking at? We're looking at borrowing.
I think really you're looking at a number of different things. I mean, first of all, in terms of if the state's going to borrow, or if any government entity is going to borrow, you want to borrow for long-term capital needs, and that's why you've done Transportation Bond Acts in the past. Truthfully, we have some concerns about the Education Bond Act, because although there is capital as an element of that, they're also going to be using it to buy technology.
Yep.
And you know, when you walk out of the Apple store, you know, the next week there's a better iPad than the one you bought. Taking debt to pay for technology that's going to be obsolete before we even start paying for it is probably not the greatest thing in the world, especially when really the state has not a lot of capacity for debt right now. So I think a bond act is something that should be discussed. There's been legislation out there on that front. Obviously, it takes the governor really to make it happen. But there's a number of different things. We have some ideas about how to restructure the gas tax in New York State, not necessarily increasing the gas tax, but making it more efficient, because you lose a lot of revenue along the way. The state dedicated fund, and we've talked about this, is not quite as dedicated as you might like it to be. There's a lot of non-capital expenses, and in fact, it's so broken that the biggest expense out of the state's dedicated highway fund is debt service. It's spending more on debt service than it is on fixing roads or bridges. That's got to be addressed. You know, scaffold law, we talk about that all the time. That's costing the state's capital spending about $1 billion a year in added insurance costs that could be going to bricks and mortar. But the reality is right now, that for infrastructure, it's not really about dedicated funds anymore at the federal level or the state level, because those don't work. It's about really being in the mix and in the fight with other general fund interests like healthcare and education and, you know, and social services. That's been happening in New York too. There have been significant infusions from the general fund into the dedicated fund at the state level. You know, that's where this is headed.
The other thing that has happened in New York is that it used to be sort of a foregone conclusion that downstate investment in public transportation would be met and matched with upstate investment in roads and bridges, because public transportation is not as large a concern. That's not happening to the degree that it used to.
Yeah, well, we lost parity with transit in the MTA in New York, I believe, during the Patterson administration. And that was a pretty significant paradigm shift. I mean, look, we want to see investment in infrastructure writ large, roads, bridges, environmental infrastructure, certainly the MTA infrastructure, and public building infrastructure as well. It's all important. Our members do all of this work. But the reality is we have major needs out there, and Comptroller Napoli, to his credit, has, I think, done a very good job of highlighting this. Over the next 20 years, $175 billion in transportation infrastructure needs, another $75 billion in environmental infrastructure needs, which don't get as much focus because you don't realize how bad it is until something happens, until there's a water main break or something. That's real money, and we're nowhere near having those types of resources. And then when you look to Washington and you see sort of the clown show that's been going on down there trying to figure out how to patch the Highway Trust Fund again, it makes it very difficult for states and certainly for our industry to plan on what's coming.
Well, obviously they're not turning off the spigot this time around. I mean, they are kicking the can down the road, as you said. How much was on the table for us to lose, theoretically?
Oh, it's billions of dollars. Now, the good news is, to their credit, the folks at DOT are great. We're great partners with them and the administration. They were prepared to be able to weather this, right? There are some states that were looking at an immediate interruption to projects that were either ongoing or in the pipeline. New York, they were in a position where they would have been able to weather this in the near term, but obviously not indefinitely, because so much of these projects are funded and supported by federal dollars. But it would have been a major disruption, and there's no good reason for it to happen. I mean, again, this is one of the fundamental responsibilities of government. And, I realize people don't like to make tough decisions, especially in even-numbered years, right? They don't like to do it, but they have to do it. It's their job, and that's why we were, frankly, kind of hoping that the Senate language would prevail, because it would have forced them to come back before the end of the year to try to come up with a longer-term strategy. And I think it's going to be easier for this Congress to do that than a new Congress.
Well, right, because we're talking about midterm elections, a new Congress, and then next year everybody will be focused on a new White House, right? So that's a different story.
Perpetual campaign.
We can't have this conversation really without talking about the Tappan Zee. And I don't know that I got your assessment on the whole fight over the loan that was made, right, from the Environmental Facilities Corporation. In the end, it was half of what was originally asked for. And the sort of conventional wisdom was that the Cuomo administration just didn't want to talk about tolls, effectively. And did you approve of that? Your organization approve of the loan?
We didn't really weigh in on it. Certainly it was something that was discussed, because we have members that are working on the Tappan Zee project. We have members that aren't, but who are highway contractors who are concerned about the outlook for the rest of the thruway system, which has growing needs, and in terms, their revenue is different because they generate their own revenue from tolls, but there's a lot of concern about what it looks like for them down the road. And then we have members that do the environmental infrastructure work as well, and the projects that are supported by the EFC. Certainly it was an innovative approach, right? I mean, I think a lot of people agreed on that. But I think to a certain degree you've got to be innovative when you're trying to figure out how to finance a multi-billion-dollar project.
Right,
I think The broader question for our members is, what is the impact of the ultimate financial plan of that one project, which is critical and it needs to be done, and we've talked about this. What's that going to mean for the rest of the throughway?
Sure, we'd like
which
to know.
has growing needs and declining revenue.
But that's the whole point, right? I mean, if in fact this loan was a way to avoid putting the entire financial plan on the table, which would require telling people exactly how much the tolls are going to go up, not only on the new bridge, which everybody knows, and I think that the Thruway Authority, Tom Madison, the executive director, has acknowledged this is going to happen. It's just the question is to what degree. Sure, but to what degree, and who's going to, will the people of the local area, for example, get a break, like the people on Staten Island get a break for the Verrazano Bridge? I mean, if you do that for them, then you have to do something for the locals in the Hudson Valley too, right? So all of these questions are circulating around, and we don't have answers to any of them.
Not yet. I mean, I presume that we will soon. But there's no question the tolls are going to be higher on a new bridge. The Tappan Zee tolls are actually relatively low now compared to other bridges in the region. And, you know, look, tolls are going to go up on the thruway system. That's the only source of revenue for the most part. There's, you know, little crumbs here and there that they get elsewhere. That's where their revenue comes from. And there are stretches of the thruway that are in condition that people have not seen the thruway in before. There are stretches that needed to be rebuilt that, instead of being rebuilt, are being patched up and being resurfaced. That's not a long-term strategy. And if that road starts to come apart, that's going to be a major challenge for the upstate economy.
So we're almost out of time. We're actually pretty much out of time, but I do want to ask you, I mean, in terms of next year and issues that we're going to be discussing, we always discuss healthcare and education. Will transportation be higher than usual?
I think it absolutely will be higher than usual because there's sort of been a sustained public focus on the issue, and certainly the media has done a good job of keeping the focus on it. You drive around, you see how bad things are, and we're going to be doing our part to make sure that it's higher on that list, because there's some difficult decisions that are going to need to be made in Albany next year as well. So we're going to be out there making the case and making sure that it is high on that list.
Well, we'll have you back then, Mike. Thanks very much.
Look forward to it. Thank you.
Opponents of high